This episode is brought to you by my friend Rebecca Walser, a financial expert who can help you protect your wealth. Book your free call with her team by going to friendofdinesh.com. That's friendofdinesh.com. Coming up, I'm going to use the occasion of Black History Month to ask the question, who was the greatest Black American of our history? I have 3 finalists, and I'll give you my ranking of 1, 2, 3, and why. Debbie's going to join me. We're going to talk about a new threat to religious liberty. We're going to talk about the horrific legacy of Jimmy Carter, and also the Netflix documentary film, very interesting. We just saw it, My Octopus Teacher. I'll also continue my discussion of the compatibility between Darwinian evolution and the book of Genesis. This is the Dinesh D'Souza Show.
America needs this voice. The times are crazy. In a time of confusion, division, and lies, we need a brave voice of reason, understanding, and truth. This is the Dinesh D'Souza Podcast.
We're in Black History Month, and so I thought I would focus today on the question, who is the greatest Black American of our history? In fact, not just who's the greatest, but who's number 1, who's number 2, who's number 3. Now, if you went to Black Studies departments or progressive scholars and asked them to give you their ranking, I think that their ranking would go like this. They would put Martin Luther King as number 1. And they would have Frederick Douglass, the runaway slave, as number 2. And they would probably have W.E.B. Du Bois as number 3. And you can see that this is a ranking that is somewhat weighted in the progressive favor. And by that I mean Martin Luther King was not really I wouldn't say clearly a Republican or a Democrat. He tended to avoid a clear identification with either party. Now, I've seen some people on social media go, Martin Luther King was a Republican. I'm actually not aware of any evidence that he specifically called himself that. Now, his father, I believe, was a Republican. Martin Luther King, I think, was sort of nothing, neither party. But he did more openly identify with Kennedy, JFK, and then certainly with LBJ, with the signing of the Civil Rights Act. I think it's probably fair to say that Martin Luther King was clearly in the Democratic camp by 1964, and if anything, he moved further left after that. So you can see the progressives are picking King because he's one of ours. We don't like his colorblind thing all that much today, but nevertheless, he was on our side. Frederick Douglass was a Republican, but you'll notice that a lot of progressive histories that talk about Frederick Douglass never mention that about him. They act like he was just, a runaway slave, and he went on to become a prominent abolitionist leader, but you'll very rarely see the words GOP or Republican Party associated with Frederick Douglass, even though Frederick Douglass became a Republican officially, was a Republican appointee, he was a diplomat in a Republican administration. And he famously said, although it's not so famous today because you don't see it highlighted, he said the Republican Party is the ship, all else is the sea, meaning you got to be a Republican, particularly if you're Black. Your only future is in the Republican Party. And third, Du Bois, who was not only a leftist, but became a socialist. In fact, became so anti-American that he left America and he moved to Ghana. And he died, I believe, at the age of 90 or 91 in Ghana when he was affirming African solidarity. He was at that point vehemently against the United States, to the point where he even said sympathetic things about Stalin and even Hitler. I don't think that W.E.B. Du Bois belongs in this top 3 ranking at all. I do agree with the other 2, but I would rearrange it. In fact, I would argue that the greatest American of our history, greatest Black American, is in fact Frederick Douglass. Far greater than, let's say, Martin Luther King. And let's look at why. First of all, Martin Luther King affirmed the colorblind ideal, and that was important. But let's remember that the moral argument against racism, the moral argument for treating people based on the content of their character, was actually a moral argument that was won at the end of World War II. Once American troops went in the gas chambers and people saw, this is the fruits of racial supremacy. This is what Nordic Nazi ideology has produced. The moral argument for racism basically collapsed. And this is why when Martin Luther King was fighting in the civil rights movement, he was fighting against some dogs and hoses and Southern sheriffs and Bull Connor, but he wasn't really fighting against a rival ideology. No one stepped forward and said, sorry, Martin Luther King, you're completely wrong. Here are 10 reasons why segregation is fantastic. No one did that. Why? Because the case for segregation had already collapsed. Now, Douglass, on the other hand, unlike Martin Luther King, was endured slavery. So he obviously suffered far more. He wrote a masterpiece, his autobiography, the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. Notice that Martin Luther King he has the letter from the Birmingham jail, which is very well worth reading. He has his famous I Have a Dream speech, but he has nothing like a classic work penned by him, which Frederick Douglass has. Frederick Douglass also had a very poignant meeting with Lincoln, in which he kind of changed his view about Lincoln. He was initially very skeptical about Lincoln, but then he realized, hey, listen, Lincoln's not giving me any special treatment. He's not the great Frederick Douglass, but he is treating me as a man. He's treating me basically as no different, whether I'm white, whether I'm black. Lincoln doesn't really see color. So in this sense, it's Frederick Douglass who's the true author of the colorblind idea, and not so much Martin Luther King. And finally, Frederick Douglass went on to talk about what he called the self-made man. By the way, this is an idea also developed by the man who is, in my view, the second greatest Black American, and that's Booker T. Washington. So in my ranking, it's Frederick Douglass number 1, it's Booker T. Washington number 2, and it's Martin Luther King number 3. Just when you thought it couldn't get any better, Mike Lindell and MyPillow are launching the MyPillow 2.0. When Mike invented MyPillow, it had everything you could want in a pillow, but now nearly 20 years later, Mike Lindell has discovered a new technology that makes MyPillow even better. The MyPillow 2.0 has the patented adjustable fill of the original MyPillow, but now with the brand new fabric that's made with a temperature regulating thread, the MyPillow 2.0 is the softest, smoothest, and coolest pillow you'll ever own. Say goodbye to tossing and turning, flipping your pillow over in the middle of the night. More great news on the MyPillow 2.0 front. Buy one, get one free. 50% off. Great deal, but you got to use promo code Dinesh. Now, the MyPillow 2.0 is machine washable and dryable, made in the USA, 10-year warranty, 60-day money-back guarantee. So check it out. Call 800-876-0227. That number, 800-876-0227, or go to mypillow.com. Don't forget to use the promo code DINESH Dinesh. I'm continuing my discussion of the greatest Black Americans of our history. As I mentioned in the last segment, a leftist historian or scholar would quite likely rank Martin Luther King number 1, Frederick Douglass number 2, and W.E.B. Du Bois number 3. My ranking is different. Frederick Douglass number 1, Booker T. Washington number 2, and Martin Luther King number 3. Now, arguably, I'm doing this because the top 2, Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, were lifelong Republicans. They both were. Martin Luther King, as I say, was sort of more ambiguous. Later in his life, he associated more with the Democratic Party. But Frederick Douglass understood that the Republican Party was founded not just as the anti-slavery party, but also as the anti-racism party. By the way, there's a very interesting book by Eric Foner, who is himself a progressive, but it talks about the legacy of the Republican Party in the North. And he talks about the fact that although, yes, you will find Republicans who uttered conventional racial views of the time, and Lincoln himself, if you forage through Lincoln, you can find certain quotations by Lincoln that, taken out of context or by themselves, would seem to imply that Lincoln isn't all that friendly, isn't granting full equality to blacks. But in context, when you see the full Lincoln, you realize that Lincoln was, in fact, had a very colorblind view. Now, he realized that other Americans didn't, and he realized that he needed the votes of those other Americans. So at times, what Lincoln would do is downplay what he himself truly believed in order to find common ground with people who thought differently. And this is, by the way, what Democratic politicians do all the time. I think the core idea of Frederick Douglass, which was then picked up by Booker T. Washington, is the idea of the self-made man. Frederick Douglass gave a speech. In fact, he gave the same speech probably 100 times or more, and it was about the self-made man. And it was, in a way, a very he was advocating the self-made man. He obviously was himself a self-made man. At the same time, he was not blind to the limitations of the self-made man. He said that self-made men could be somewhat arrogant because they thought, hey, listen, I've done it all myself. Not only have I not walked the same path as other people, but I've made my own path. I've made the path that I'm walking on. And yet, says Frederick Douglass, despite all that, self-made men can be somewhat crude. They can be somewhat arrogant. They attribute more to themselves and downplay the fact that they are dependent on society. They do depend upon certain other things that enable their success. But Douglass goes, still, you got to remember that the self-made man is the guy who takes charge of himself. He realizes that he's not in full control. We are all dealt a deck of cards, and you can't change the cards you're dealt with, right? You can't change your genes, your genetic makeup. You can't change your early socialization. Those are kind of things that are given to you. They're outside of your control. But, says Frederick Douglass, what differentiates the self-made man is the self-made man kind of embraces it. He goes, okay, listen, I've been dealt this deck of cards. Now I've got to play these cards as well as I can in the game of life. And I'm going to take full responsibility for that. And I'm not going to say that I'm not able to do this because of that. I'm not going to hold, in a sense, the cards that I've got against me. I'm going to play them as well as I can, seeking the opportunities where they do become available. In a very famous speech, Douglass was asked a question: what should be done for the Negro or for the slave? And remarkably, he answered nothing. Think about it. We're talking about 1865. We're talking about the aftermath of the Civil War. You've got these poor slaves who are starting out at the very bottom rung of the ladder. Many of them have absolutely nothing, and they don't even have basic skills. And you might think that Frederick Douglass is in favor of, oh no, let's do this and let's do that and let's have all kinds of handouts and let's provide them with a secure retirement. What about the older slaves who now can't work and so on? Instead, Frederick Douglass goes, leave us alone. He goes, you've, quote, done enough for us already. If you leave us alone, he goes, it will be hard at the beginning, but we will slowly and painfully begin to work our way up. We'll learn the skills we need. We'll reunite with our families and rebuild the family as an institution. In other words, Frederick Douglass is the true Republican. He's a true Republican in the sense, not that he is in principle against government help or anything like that, but the focus is on not just the individual, but it's also on the family, it's on the community, it's upon doing things locally instead of doing them in a centralized fashion. And then, of course, this is picked right up by the second greatest American, Booker T. Washington. Again, I recommend to you his book, Up From Slavery, if you haven't read it. A true classic, because in it you see the Republican spirit. You see a guy who is uncomplaining, who accepts his condition, who's pragmatic and realistic in recognizing the limitations under which he's operating, which is, by the way, the deeply segregated South. This was the South 100 years ago when segregation was at its height. And nevertheless, you see a man who's able to rise above his own circumstances and then through his untiring efforts create pathways for other blacks around him to also improve their lives. So a real recipe book, if you will, not just for blacks, by the way, but for any group starting out at the bottom, starting out with the first rung of the ladder. Booker T. Washington, like Frederick Douglass, shows you how to climb up rung by rung by rung. Where are you without your health? Well, we all need it, and sometimes we need a fresh start. Now, the phrase literally means an opportunity to begin something again. You know you need a fresh start in your eating habits, right? How many times last year did you say to yourself, I need to start eating better? Well, Debbie and I are trying to do it. But eating the right amount of fruits and veggies every single day is almost impossible. I have a much better, more convenient way for you to make the fresh start with Balance of Nature. Now, Balance of Nature is sourced from 31 whole fruits and vegetables. You'll get maximum nutrition with their star product, fruits and veggies in a capsule. Debbie and I take them daily. You should too. And right now, take advantage of Balance of Nature's New Year's offer. Get $25 off plus free fiber and spice with your first preferred order of fruits and veggies when you use discount code America. This offer can end at any time, so act now. Call 800-246-8751. That's 800-246-8751, or go to balanceofnature.com. Use discount code America. Debbie and I customarily do the podcast together on Friday, but here we are on Wednesday, a little earlier than usual, because there's some issues we wanted to talk about. We've been talking about them at home, and we thought it'd be kind of fun to bring our conversation to the podcast. The first thing you were telling me about is, I guess it's an issue involving religious freedom and involving this young guy, this young policeman who got reprimanded. So tell a little bit about who he is and what happened and what the issue is.
Before we do that, First Liberty, our friend Kelly Shackelford, founded this organization that defends people's First Amendment right, for the free exercise clause of the First Amendment, which protects their religious liberty, their religious freedom. And it bans people from discriminating against them because of it.
Well, particularly the state.
The state, exactly, the state. Yeah. And so, or jobs, So in this particular case, this young man, his name is Jacob Kersey. He's 19 years old, police officer. First of all, I think he'd only been on the job a little while, maybe, 6 months or so. Not long. But he has a private Facebook page. And that's the other thing is if you are a police officer, a firefighter, or whatever, you have a job that is a public job, you can have a private Facebook page, and he did. And in the page, so we get to, sometimes we post things we want to post. Hey, shout out to my mom. My mom's birthday was last week. And so, I don't write very many posts, but when I do, it's whatever you want to write about. Well, he apparently wrote, marriage refers to Christ and the church. That's why there is no such thing as homosexual marriage. That's what he wrote on his Facebook page. And he probably didn't think much of it, except that he was, giving his biblical opinion of his conviction, right? His biblical conviction. And the following day, his supervisor called him and told him to take down the post. So, this was something that he was like shocked, first of all, it's my page, it's my private page. I'm not writing this on behalf of the police department. And this police department is in Georgia, I believe.
Yeah, it's near Savannah.
Yeah.
Well, I find it interesting that they go on to say that it is, quote, the same thing as saying the N-word or F the homosexuals. And they said, quote, he could not post things like that and that his free speech was limited because, after all, he's a police officer. So I think a key point here is this is not a guy who is in the exercise of his police duties saying things like, you homosexuals don't deserve to be doing what you're doing. There's a distinction being made between his representing the police department and acting in his duties as a policeman and what he's saying on his private Facebook page. A whole different matter. So anyway, First Liberty is on the case, I'm happy to say. Yeah.
So anyway, so he was placed on administrative leave while the city is investigating. And then about a week later, he received a letter saying that he would be terminated for any post on his private social media if any other statement or action could be perceived as offensive. And he realized that he faced a choice: either compromise his deeply held religious beliefs or continue to be a police officer. And so he had no choice but to resign because he chose his religious belief.
And coming to what First Liberty's position on this, which I think is very sound, it's, look, government and government here includes the police department. Let's remember that government here is used broadly to cover not just Congress, but all of government, by the way, federal government and state governments and institutions of the state, which obviously this would be a little bit more difficult to fight if it was a private organization, because then they would say we have every right to make our rules and he doesn't have to work here. But if you're working for a state entity, they have to follow the Constitution. So government shall pass no law restricting religious liberty or the freedom of exercise of religion, which is what he's exercising. I mean, he doesn't he makes it more than clear that the reason he has his position on marriage is because of Christ,
right?
And because of the Bible.
Because of the Bible, and so First Liberty goes on to say the idea that an employer can threaten to fire an employee for simply expressing a deeply held religious belief while off duty is chilling. The discrimination this young man, this public servant faced, could have come out of the Orwellian novel. So it really goes to show you that this is not only outrageous, but dystopian.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I think where the Orwell reference comes alive is the idea that, look, I mean, here's the police department sort of foraging through the Facebook posts of its employees, as if to say that you're not entitled to have any kind of a life that is outside the surveillance or scrutiny of your employers. I think that's the reason for the Orwellian reference, which is appropriate for that reason.
Yeah, so we'll see how this goes, and we'll keep you informed. Maybe we'll even bring Kelly back on the podcast to talk about it, because this is really important, and I think that it's good to.
And the good thing with First Liberty is they spot these cases and they immediately jump into them, because the idea is to stop these infringements even before they fully occur so that they can be prevented in the future. Despite the U.S. blowing through the $31.4 trillion debt ceiling in January, the White House still refuses to reduce spending. While our national leadership seems to have buried their heads in the sand when it comes to fiscal responsibility, hey, it's time for you and me to pull ours out. Now would be a great time to diversify into gold with Birch Gold. That's why I buy gold in times of high uncertainty and instability. I want something dependable. Birch Gold makes it easy to convert an IRA or 401k into an IRA in precious metals. Think about this. To dig our country out of this mountain of debt, every single taxpayer in America would have to write a check for $247,000. Wow. Protect yourself with gold today by texting Dinesh to 989898. With an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau, thousands of happy customers, countless 5-star reviews, Birch Gold is who I trust to protect my future and yours. So get started. Text Dinesh to 989898 today. And Jimmy Carter, former President Carter, appears to be, well, in the sunset of his life. I say this because after being confined and treated in a hospital, he has evidently now been released to home hospice care. And there's a statement that came out of the Carter Center. After a series of short hospital stays, former U.S. President Jimmy Carter today decided to spend his remaining time at home with his family and receive hospice care instead of additional medical intervention. He has the full support of the family. The Carter family asked for privacy and so on. It seems here that, and Carter is, I mean,
he's 98 years old.
He's 98 years old.
So he has lived a very long life. And, again, we're not here to attack him personally, or at least I'm not. And I do send well wishes to his family.
Yeah, of course. Now, the left is sort of using this as an occasion to say, look, and they know it's really difficult for them to defend Carter's actual record, because for anyone who lived during those years, they were the miserable years. And in fact, even Carter knew they were the miserable years, because he started talking about a national malaise, a kind of national disease that the whole country had as a result of his own leadership. So it's Carter's own record as president, horrific. In fact, this is the reason why, even as an incumbent, he got clobbered by Reagan 44 states, I think, to Reagan, 6 to Carter. And Carter could not believe that he had lost in that way.
That was a great election.
That was a really fun election.
I remember it like it was yesterday. I was 14 years old, but I was all for Ronald Reagan, you know.
I mean, Carter was a complete disgrace. His record was horrible. And you make the point that I guess one during his presidency and one after, in some ways he contributed to the destruction of 2 countries.
Well, you know, one of the reasons, interestingly enough, that I really did not like this man or didn't like his policies or his ideology, his actions were not really so much for what he did to this country, which was bad enough, but what he did to 2 other countries. And one, of course, affected me personally because it was Venezuela. As you know, many know that I talk about Venezuela a lot. And Jimmy Carter had, you know, of course, the Jimmy Carter Center, which went around, you know, Latin America certifying elections. You know, they thought that they were going
self-appointed
arbiters of elections. And one of these elections was actually a recall election in 2004 in Venezuela that was going to go on the way of recalling Hugo Chavez because he was such a horrific president. And in fact, a friend of mine who was a politician at the time, she was pretty much the architect of this recall election, and she said that not only did they cheat, and this is when the whole Smartmatic machines actually came into existence because Hugo Chavez facilitated these machines. He actually had somebody create them so that he could cheat. The Carter Center went to Venezuela and basically said, nothing to see here. It's all good.
They dispelled any foreign suspicions that the election had been thoroughly rigged by the incumbent regime.
Right.
And now, of course, there's much wider acceptance that basically Chavez and then his successor Maduro are dictators. They aren't really democratically elected. Many people today would consent to that. But in 2004, at a critical time, and this, I think the sick thing about the Carter Center people is they actually knew
it, right? They even told her that they knew that there had been cheating, but that there was really nothing that she could do about it or anyone could do about it.
Or that they intended
to do about it. So again, the demise of Venezuela, and I take it personally because it was actually the demise of my own family. My grandparents' wealth, their land, all of the things they worked so hard for all those years. And so I really look at Jimmy Carter and go, why? Why did you do this?
Well, let's remember that before that, let's now go to
Oh, yes, of course.
Jimmy Carter was the one who pulled the Persian rug out from under the Shah. The Shah was in trouble. And the Shah was a kind of a weak man because when the mullahs started agitating in Iran, I mean, think about it. We've been living with the Iranian Revolution now for half a century. All of Islamic fundamentalism and radicalism comes at the root out of that. Khomeini was the founder of it all. Not the intellectual founder, but the political founder, the first Islamic radical to come to power in a major Islamic country. I won't say Arab country because Iran is not an Arab country. But what Carter did is when the Shah turned to America for support, Carter refused. Carter basically goes, you're a dictator. I'm holier than thou. I can't support you. And so we abandoned our ally. And the Shah fell and the mullahs came in. And of course, what happened? In trying to get rid of the bad guy, Jimmy Carter got the worst guy. And that's a cardinal principle to keep in mind in foreign policy. In getting rid of the bad guy, make sure you don't get the worst guy. So Jimmy Carter, you know, there's a saying that we used to say in the Reagan years, lose a country, gain a restaurant, right? You lose a country, but then you get an Afghan restaurant. And with Jimmy Carter, I think what the left is saying is like, lose 3 countries, America and Iran and Venezuela, but, you know, gain some drywall on your roof because after after all, Jimmy Carter spent some years with Habitat for Humanity. Here's a video of him and he's putting up some drywall or making a table. Who the heck cares about the table? Give us back the countries that you abandoned. Undo the horrific record. Well, I guess he can't. There's nothing that can be done about it. And it's merely a matter of retrospective analysis. But I don't think that we need to kowtow to Jimmy Carter as if he's some sort of a noble man or a great man. He most manifestly is not. His record is an absolute unmitigated disaster. There's a new movie coming out from the creators of I Can Only Imagine that Debbie and I just got to see. It's called Jesus Revolution. It's based on the true story of Pastor Chuck Smith in Southern California in the 1970s and how he opened the doors of his languishing church to an unexpected group of young people looking for love and truth, hippies, and it led to the greatest faith revival in American history. Again, it's called Jesus Revolution. It's got a great cast: Joel Courtney, Jonathan Rumi, whom we all love from The Chosen, and Kelsey Grammer. It's rated PG-13 for some drug use, being authentic to the time, so some material may be inappropriate for children under 13. Jesus Revolution, we loved it. It'll be in theaters everywhere beginning February 24th. You gotta see it, and for tickets and showtimes, go to jesusrevolution.movie. Again, it's jesusrevolution.movie. The last segment, we were talking about Jimmy Carter. I noticed you were sort of slightly wincing or cringing. I don't know what's the right term.
I think I cringed a little bit. I just said, "Oh, that was really harsh, honey."
I like to wind up for these kind of harsh.
I know, but yeah,
summaries.
Poor guy, and you know he is.
Well, I mean, he's in a pathetic state, but I mean, everyone reaches that pathetic state at 98.
I get it, but you know, again, I'm not. Yes, he was, his record was horrific, and I know that they're going to try to paint over that. And in fact, in America, they don't even talk about those things, right? They don't talk about the fact that Iran is in the mess it's in because of him. Venezuela's in the mess it's in because of him. They don't say that. But.
And you see the long-term damage of what Democrats do. And I think, by the way, we'll see the same with Biden. People will look back at the Biden years and go, wow, this is when this happened. This is when we lost this. This is when we lost that. And we may not be getting some of these things back.
Yeah.
So this is the price of electing Democrats. But let's talk about the film we just saw. It's a documentary film. It won the Academy Award. It's called My Octopus Teacher. And you can, by the way, you can watch it on Netflix. So much on Netflix is garbage.
Most of it,
just about. We don't really like Netflix. However, it's not that we won't watch something on Netflix, and we did. In fact, a number of people told us, watch this film.
Yeah, several of our friends told us to watch it. And we're like, really? A movie, a documentary about an octopus, really?
About a man's relationship with an octopus. It almost seems a little creepy.
Yeah, we thought, what?
What the heck is this? But we were actually visiting Debbie's mom in the Rio Grande Valley, and we thought it'd be kind of cool. Let's all watch this.
We were there one day, and we decided to do this with Mom.
This was our after dinner.
Of course, she falls asleep every time we watch a movie, but that's another story.
I think this one, for the most part, held her attention.
Yeah, I think so.
And anyway, the plot is very simple. You got this guy, and he's a South African. And the venue of the film is the Cape. It's he calls it the Cape of Storms, and apparently it's a part of South Africa that is just whipped and lashed by the Atlantic Ocean.
It's beautiful.
It's stunningly beautiful, but you've also got. I think the closest thing in America is probably Big Sur,
probably,
right? The place where you've got rocks, you've got water surging. He talks about the fact that when he was young, they have it's called a kind of a wooden house right by the ocean, and the water would just come into the house. I don't know if obviously you can't have carpets and things like that, but he grew up there, and he grew up with the ocean right next to him. So I want to tell a little more about the plot of the film, but it may be easier. What was your thought? What was your expectation in watching the film, and what was your take having seen it?
Well, I didn't realize that he's a marine biologist, and he and the one thing when the movie first started is the fact that he was deep diving. He was going underwater with no tank. Right? He just had how when you go snorkeling, you have that little thing that sticks out, of the water, the little, I don't know what you call it, the little tube. whatever. I mean, I can't even snorkel. I'm so claustrophobic that going underwater freaks me out. So I was a little afraid that I was going to get a little kind of creeped out. But it was so beautiful and it was so cinematic and just beautifully shot. But anyway, so that was my first impression when I first saw it was the fact that, wow, he was explaining how he did not wear, it was, first of all, it's very cold. Didn't he say 10 degrees Celsius or something?
Yeah, so about
very,
50
very
degrees
cold.
Fahrenheit, cold water.
Yeah, and he had no wetsuit. He just, he had his little shorts, his little swim trunks, and just, nothing. And I was like, well, isn't he going to get hypothermia? I thought it was incredible. But then,
So a couple interesting things about this. The guy is undergoing a sort of a life crisis.
Yeah.
He's sort of lost his way. His career is he's a filmmaker. And I guess he typically does diving and also on land. He goes with a team that does underwater photography and does filming also on land. But he says he was having problems being a good husband, having problems being a good daddy as a young son.
Yeah, he was burned out.
He was burned out. He was disconnected from the world.
Yeah.
And so the remarkable thing about this film is how this guy recovers a sense of meaning and purpose in life. And he does it weirdly by doing underwater diving, again, as Debbie says, without equipment. And part of his reason for not wearing a wetsuit is to be kind of, you can say, at one with nature. He wants to be closer to the forest, as he calls it, under the water, the leaves and the kelp and the all forms of marine life. At one point in the film, he talks about the fact that he was making a film about some trackers in the Kalahari. And he said he noticed about those guys, and you can see them in the film, that they were so attentive to nature that they were almost one with nature. They weren't separated from nature. It wasn't like, here's nature, nature's the object and I'm the subject, but rather they're part of nature and they can recognize the tracks that are very faint tracks of various different types of animals. And so he wanted that kind of connection with nature, and he saw that as a way to recover his connection with himself and also with his family. And so this is a story of a man who undertakes this kind of a journey. And I think it's the fact that this isn't just a, quote, nature film. It's a film about his relationship, unbelievably, with an octopus.
And we'll talk about that in the next segment.
Let's talk about it. Yep. My dad didn't believe in the stock market. He was kind of a put your money in the bank guy. But I discovered in the early 1990s that investing in the market can be highly profitable. It makes sense if you're in it for the long term. Problem is, in the short term, we're in a very rocky economy. A lot of bad policy, a lot of craziness at home, and a lot of instability abroad. There's always the risk of a black swan event, a single event that comes out of nowhere and basically cripples your savings. So how do we take advantage of the upside of the market and protect ourselves against the downside? We need some really good expert guidance here. My friend Rebecca Walser is a tax attorney and wealth strategist with her MBA from the London School of Economics. I've had her on the podcast. I'll bring her back periodically to give an assessment of current events. She and her team can help protect your wealth during these unprecedented times. Go to friendofdinesh.com and book your complimentary introductory call today to see if you qualify. Again, that's friendofdinesh.com. Debbie and I are talking about a documentary film we just watched together with family. It's called My Octopus Teacher. And I was saying at the end of the last segment, what's really remarkable about this film, it's about a man's relationship. I mean, we heard about people having a relationship with a cat or with a dog, a domestic animal. An octopus is a tiny mollusk. It's basically a little ball of substance with these tentacles and suckers. It's got, 100 or more suckers. And
about 2,000, I think he said.
2,000.
I think he said that.
And it floats in the water, and it has its own sort of ecosystem and life. And yet this guy, and this is what makes this film, I think, kind of amazing, and like your take on it, is he doesn't just go onto the water and go, okay, there's a bunch of different trees here and a bunch of different animals, and it's so spectacularly beautiful. He decides to form a relationship with one particular animal, and it turns out to be an octopus.
The octopus, yeah. So when he first saw it, it really, one of the things I think that he was surprised at was the fact that the octopus kind of looked at him.
Checked him out,
you know, and like, who are you? And he was like, I was trying to build trust. And I'm like thinking, you're trying to build trust with an octopus? I mean, you know, but he basically equated the intelligence of the octopus like a domestic cat or dog. And he said that in fact, a couple of times he dropped the camera or he dropped something and he startled the octopus and he was like, oh, I blew it. I can't believe I did that. You know,
because the octopus was reaching out to him.
Yeah, he was reaching out to him like he was going to touch him. And then it scared him and he like whisked off and they create this plume behind them, which is actually a kind of a defense mechanism to blind the predator. But anyway, so he just kept going every day, every single day. And the other thing that I was surprised to hear was that an octopus life span is only 1 year. So he, you know,
this is part of the pathos of the film because the film has a beautiful narrative arc. In fact, it follows almost the classic arc of any good story, in which you have something that sets off the narrator. In this case, it was his own personal crisis. Then he encounters the octopus and he has the initial interactions with it. Then there's a setback. He loses the octopus. He has to find it and he has to use all kinds of clever research, studying octopus habits and so on to find the octopus. Then the relationship between the two unbelievably deepens.
Oh, and not only that, but he pets it. You know, it comes and it lands on his chest and he pets it just like you would a cat or a dog. I was just like,
well, interestingly, the octopus,
amazing.
he says, has the ability to recognize that this creature, a human, is not a threat.
Yeah.
That this human is not there to eat him. And of course, in the storyline, we see these.
Oh, yeah.
And I think the beauty of the film is it's able to take incidents that otherwise would be uneventful. A shark attacks the octopus, kind of knocks out one of its arms or one of its limbs.
Which regenerates, you know, and I knew that, but I was like, oh wait, his arm's going to grow back, right? You know, so.
But I mean, you feel emotionally moved.
Emotionally. And he was like super emotional because he wanted to actually protect the octopus from the shark. But he said, I can't do that. I have to let it play out. And I thought that was like pretty amazing.
The good thing about this film is it doesn't have any kind of climate change sort of fanaticism in it. This guy doesn't even go there.
And he might be, you know, his wife is an Indian conservationist. So
Asian
Indian conservationist, yeah, and also filmmaker. So she co-produced this documentary, which won the Academy Award, by the way. I think, did you say that at the beginning?
It did.
Yeah.
It did.
So anyway, but it just was so incredible. And every day that he would film, he would come back and he would say something about it and how it had like changed him. Like somehow he wasn't the same person.
It seems like he made the film over a year. In fact, that was the year of the octopus's life. So you can already anticipate, and we're not giving anything away by telling you that the film ends with the octopus dying. And it's remarkable, a little mollusk that dies, and yet it's kind of an emotional event. And why? Not so much because we sort of feel for the octopus, it's that we understand the relationship that he developed weirdly with this creature, with this animal. You know, there was an essay, a philosophical essay written many years ago. I think I've alluded to it on the podcast by Thomas Nagel. It's called, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And Thomas Nagel's point is that consciousness is so interior. Our consciousness is our own. A bat has its own type of consciousness. We will never know what it's like to be a bat. But the amazing thing in this film is this guy tries to find out.
He tries to find out what it is to be an octopus.
He does. He says, I wanted to develop an octopus's mind. I wanted to see the ocean the way an octopus saw it.
Yeah.
And I think he feels... I mean, I think he knows he can't do that. Yeah. He can't become an octopus,
but the vulnerability of the octopus and like really thwarting off the predators and everything. And he said, you know, that he took that into his life. That is how he lives his life today. Now, it took us going to Israel to really know the true meaning of life and God and everything. And maybe this man, that's how he, you know,
he learned things like he learned ultimately a gentleness toward nature. You can see at the end of the film, it's kind of touching. He restores his relationship with his son, and the two of them are like diving together.
Yeah, his son is like a little clone of him, right?
He really is.
He goes in there, dives just like he does with no tank. It's kind of crazy.
And his is the only voice in the film. His son, you see him doing things, but he doesn't really speak. And the wife, although she's a producer, she doesn't appear in the film at all.
I think she appears, her back appears.
At one point you see a profile.
Yeah, but that's it.
It's a very interesting film. If you watch it, you won't regret it. And it will make you feel, and it will also make you think. Debbie and I started taking Relief Factor a couple of years ago. The difference we've seen in our joints has been nothing short of amazing. Aches and pains are gone thanks to this 100% drug-free solution called Relief Factor. Relief Factor supports your body's fight against inflammation. That's the source of aches and pains. The vast majority of people who try Relief Factor love it. They order more because it works for them. Debbie's a true believer. She can now do the exercises that for a long time she wasn't able to do. Relief Factor has been a real game changer for her aunt, other members of our family, Mike here in the studio, and many other people. You too can benefit. Try it for yourself. Order the 3-week quick start for the discounted price of only $19.95. Go to relieffactor.com or call the new number 800-4-relief to find out more about this offer. That number again, 800-4-relief, or go to relieffactor.com. Feel the difference. I want to pick up my discussion of evolution, Darwinian evolution, and in today's segment, I'm going to actually make the case for evolution. Now, I'm going to be subsequently pointing out limitations of evolution, what evolution doesn't show and doesn't prove, but here I want to focus on what evolution does do. And evolution is, it should be said at the outset, very well established in the field of biology. Virtually every prominent biologist in the world supports some form of evolution or the other. In other words, the belief in evolution is as universal today among biologists as, say, the belief about the Big Bang is among physicists, or the theory of relativity is among physicists worldwide. You're going to get numbers around 99% or higher that accept evolution, that, yeah, evolution did occur. We might debate some of the details about how, but that evolution occurred, we do agree. It's important to know that. It's also important to know that some of the objections to evolution that seem commonsensical have in fact been answered. Is the fossil record inadequate? Well, yeah, it is, in the sense that you don't have every intermediate form, but it's also true that there are now hundreds of thousands of fossils. And so while you don't have every fossil, you have a lot of them. And as a result of that, you're able to put fossils together and also date them. You're able to lay them out, let's say, on a very long table according to date. And we'll come back to this, but the layout, the pattern that you see is actually very revealing. Some people say that it's impossible for the eye to evolve because an eye is a fully developed sort of organ. And how can you have half an eye or a quarter of an eye? Well, as it turns out, you sort of can. And by that I mean that you find very primitive creatures, even today, that don't really have eyes. They just have a few light cells in the place of an eye. And can they see? Well, the answer is they can't really see, at least not in the way that you and I can. But nevertheless, having those sparse light cells gives them a little better access to their environment than if they didn't have them. So in other words, a few light cells is better than none. More light cells, of course, is better than having a few, and having partial vision is better than having no vision. So it's quite possible that the eye evolved piece by piece by making people's sight better and better and better in such a way that you finally got what we would now call full human vision. In fact, there are some biologists who believe that the eye has independently evolved multiple times. Why? Because the eyes in certain species are so different one from the other that they couldn't have evolved directly from each other, and perhaps not even from a single common ancestor, but evolved separately. Now, what about this business about microevolution and macroevolution? Well, as it turns out, macroevolution is just microevolution that occurs, in a sense, on a wider canvas, so over a larger stretch of time. I mean, think of it this way. Take two species like the lion and the tiger. They're different species. And yet you can tell there's a similarity among them. Lions and tigers are not the same, but on the other hand, they have a lot of traits in common. They're both, for example, big and wild cats. They belong to the cat family, if you will. So here's the point I want to make. When you look at life, and you recognize that all life is made from the same common materials. All life is based on DNA. The DNA molecule is present in humans. It's present in mollusks. It's present in cats. It's also present in trees. So when you look at the living cell and find that it's present in all humans, so you've got life itself all over the place for all its differences, having commonalities, and yet there are important differences among different life forms, differences in mobility, differences in the way life processes food, differences in reproduction, differences, of course, in intelligence. And the beauty of evolution is it actually makes sense of both. In other words, it makes sense of the fact that, yeah, obviously all life must have had a common origin, and that's why you find the same kind of cell, the same kind of molecule in all living things. But at the same time, we see enormous differences among different life forms, and evolution shows you how those differences came about. They came about because these different life forms had to adapt over very long periods of time to different conditions, and as a result, they adapted differently. And as a result of mutation, some life forms adapted better. They survived. Those traits survived, and others did not adapt very well or were not very well adapted, and those traits died off. So evolution provides a kind of ingenious explanation. It's not that the trait itself, it's not that the giraffe keeps stretching its neck. It's just that giraffes that have shorter necks die off because they can't reach the taller trees, and giraffes that have longer necks survive, then they have children, and those giraffes also have longer necks. So this is how we get the long-necked giraffe. The evolutionary explanation is in some senses very simple, which makes it all the more astonishing that really before Darwin in the 19th century, no one really ever thought of it, or no one described it in any level of detail the way that Darwin did. It's very simple, it's very elegant, and it does make a lot of sense of both the unity but also the diversity of life that we see.
Subscribe to the Dinesh D'Souza podcast on Apple, Google, and Spotify, or watch on Rumble, YouTube, and SalemNow.com.